unbelievable. They let half their population not be citizens, but that was Athens. One of the things, too, which is really sad, is girls just weren't as valued as highly as boys in Athenian society. Boys went to school, boys were citizens. Girls did not get those privileges. Now, girls could get an education if their parents got them a private tutor. But what that meant, essentially, is only the wealthiest of girls received any education at all. And from that, girls, they weren't allowed to take part in war. They weren't allowed to take part in business. They weren't allowed to take part in education. So we see that Athens, which touted the idea of freedom, touted the idea of being what you wanted to be, it didn't apply to all of its people, only half, only the gentlemen, which is a real bummer, and I think a problem with Athenian society, because we often, particularly our school is a classical school. We admire the Western tradition, but there are some things that we need to do better, and I'm thankful that we've got lots of young ladies here getting awesome educations, and how girls now are allowed to do all the things, because we know a girl can do anything that a boy can do. And we're seeing that today as we're going to have our first female vice president, which I think is pretty awesome that we've finally got something like that happening. So that's some aspects of Athenian culture. Now let's look about Athenian art. Now, the Athenians thought beauty and art was so important. They wanted to beautify the world. They wanted to make the world a more enjoyable place to see and to live in. And they did this through art. And they made tons of sculptures, and they often chose to have people as the object of their sculptures. Now, I know, unfortunately, Athenian art often has people being naked. I know, gross. But also, you'll notice that pretty much everybody looks the same for the most part in Athenian art. Like, we have all of these statues of ladies, and it was always what the Athenians thought of as the ideal version of a girl. Like, we know that everyone comes in different shapes and sizes, but if you look at Athenian statues, they're all the same, because they said this is what the idea of the perfect girl would be. And that was their societal idea, just like how every society has different ideas of what beauty is. I mean, if the Greeks saw like some of our fashion magazines, they would be like, what in the world is this craziness? Just like how, different parts of the world would say different ideas about what is beauty. For gentlemen, they thought that boys were supposed to have, the ideal boy had like all of those crazy muscles and all of that. I don't want you to think, though, that this is what all the Greeks look like. Like, every Greek person wasn't a bodybuilder. Maybe some of them were, but most Greek people looked like regular people. It's just their statues trying to have the idealized version, have all the ripped muscles and everything like that. And we see that they have tons of things going on. They're going to have sculptures, lots of paintings, lots of poetry. They had lots of theater, comedies, and tragedies. And they loved making pottery, too. One of the most common things of pottery you'll see, and you've seen these before, are amphoras, where you have, these vases, which would often hold olive oil or wine, and they'd have depictions of history, mythology, all sorts of things. So the Greek amphora is a very common thing, and you surely have seen amphoras. Here we have the story of Daedalus right there. That's such a good story. And Icarus. I bet you Alicia could tell you all that story. And we will get to mythology in a week or two, I think. And we'll spend like a good week or two on mythology I'm excited about. The Athenians, although they also preached freedom, practiced slavery. And this was through all of Greece. There were slaves. Typically, the Greeks had slaves that were people captured in war, and they preferred to have non-Greeks. But that wasn't always the case. In fact, there were times that parents even sold their children into slavery to make money. Can you believe it, how terrible that is? This idea where, they're like, well, we've got a couple kids here. We can go spare one to make a quick buck. Yeah, they would do that. And sometimes people were born into slavery as well if their parents were slaves. But like I said, the Greeks typically tried to avoid having fellow Greeks as slaves, but it did happen. Once again, like I said, Athens was all about freedom, but not for everyone. They didn't give full freedom to girls, and they didn't give freedom to people who were slaves. All right, now we're going to transition a little bit looking at the city-state of Sparta. We'll spend the next 3 days talking about Sparta, and here we see Sparta there. And we have this big line showing exactly where Sparta is in the Peloponnesian Peninsula. Now, Sparta, as we know, focused all about war. It focused all about strength. How could Sparta be the strongest? And it had super duper strict laws. And we believe the impetus to have these such strict laws was because there was an early slave revolt. And it killed a lot of Spartans, and it gave them, said, hey, we need to be super strict or people might rise up and hurt us again. And one of the things is they demanded that people showed more loyalty to Sparta, the state, rather than themselves, rather than their family, to anything else. So Sparta was considered the most important thing. And we see that with the idea of, poor Draco, he didn't go and spend any time having fun. He spent his time training for war, being a tool, instead of getting to be a person. And unfortunately, we don't have any art from Sparta. The statues of Spartans typically weren't made by Spartans. They only focused on war skills. That was the only way they thought you could have honor as a man, to be a warrior. The only way they thought a girl could have honor was being strong and being a mother. That was it. It's very one-sided and, unfortunate that they were like that. Okay, now we're going to go on to our last slide. So Sparta will have an oligarchy, which will be on our Quizzy-Poo, so I do recommend playing that Kahoot. I'd say play your Kahoot often. And that's roll by a few. Now, the city-state had 2 kings and a council of elders. And basically, these 2 kings, they were like the head generals, essentially. Typically one king would go out to war and one king would stay, but the elders would make most of the real decisions. But as a citizen of Sparta, you were encouraged not to speak up. You couldn't complain because then you're going against Sparta. So it was not a free place. Like, you couldn't think or say whatever you wanted. Sparta was very strict that way. And this is actually where we're going to pause our discussions about Sparta, and we'll continue on more tomorrow. I am stopping the recording, and I'm asked